Shavua Tov, welcome to episode number 3. Today we're going to talk about capitalism, profit, exploitation, and ruthlessness. Ruthlessness is often a word left out of this conversation. People often talk about capitalism, profit, and exploitation, but I find that ruthlessness is extremely important to discuss also. First, we have to talk about Karl Marx. And we are not going to talk about Marxism in the sense of a political ideology. We'll get to communism later. But rather, Marxism as a lens through which one might view history. With the rise of Marxist thinking, this material view of history has permeated basically everything. The worst of the so-called capitalists today are also Marxists in an academic sense, in that they too view the world as a history of material resources and who gets access to those resources. And access to those resources is representing class. Marx views history as the struggle between classes and the eventual rise of the lower classes over the upper classes who have exploited them. However, in order to discuss these terms with any honesty, we have to go back to their definition. So, let's start with capitalism. Capitalism is an organization of the economy based on distributed decision-making in which individuals own private property. That property can be accumulated to the point at which there is a great enough excess so that you are no longer concerned only with matters of survival. You can invest that excess in the endeavors of others. The act of having invested this excess capital entitles you to some prearranged portion of whatever profits are made by this other individual's ventures in whom you have invested. This is how the richest of the rich in capitalist society have their money. They have invested in many entities who go out and work far more hours than any one person could work on their own. And because this person has invested in all of these other people's working hours and get a portion of each of these people's working hours, they make far more money than they could ever work for at their own hourly rate, right? If you are making money off of, let's say, 1,000 cumulative hours per week, you can't work 1,000 hours per week. There aren't 1,000 hours in a week. So, capitalism is, on the one hand, we talk about the investment of excess resources into those without the resources to start an enterprise of their own. On the other hand, it also affects every single individual in terms of the decisions that they make on a daily basis. So in capitalism, all of the choices are yours. Now, this is somewhat misleading in that you don't have every choice in the world. If you go to the store and all they sell is Coke, Pepsi, Fanta, and water, you can't buy milk. So there you have a choice, but obviously a choice limited by the market. Ultimately, this is far more democratic than a planned economy by the very nature that decision-making is distributed. On a daily basis, each one of us gets to decide how we wish to spend our resources called money. Do we want to spend it on coffee, on food, on plane tickets, on rent, on a mortgage? Do we have that ability? So each person makes decisions, but is confined in his or her ability to make those decisions by the number of resources available. Okay, so now let's talk about exploitation. Exploitation is to use a person or a thing exclusively for your own profit, right? And this is the name of the game from the beginning of dawn until now. prior to Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, and later Marx and Das Kapital, and all of the modern writers who will give capitalism its form to which we can point in an academic sense, the economies of the Western world were based on pure human exploitation, namely slavery. There is a serious misconception in the American cultural sphere that slavery is a phenomenon particular to the transatlantic slave trade and race relations that exist within the United States as a result of the kind of slavery that existed here. The kind of slavery that existed here was instead the product of many thousands of years prior of different forms of slavery that in the American context took on a racial element. From the time of the earliest civilizations in the cradle of civilization, the Middle East, whether we're talking about Akkadians or Babylonians, Sumerians, Egyptians, Assyrians, later on also Jews, Israelites, whatever you want to call them, Aramaeans, and certainly Greeks, and most certainly Romans. The way to build anything was to conquer your neighbors, enslave them, and have them build the stuff that the people you consider your own, the ones who are part of the conquerors, get instead to enjoy a life of relative leisure compared to those that they exploit. Now, the feudal times saw a form of slavery in Europe in which most people were not exactly called slaves. However, they were not allowed to leave the portion of land they inhabited and were forced to turn over 95% of what they produced to a feudal lord. And this is undeniable exploitation, and clearly a system that benefits very few, in which the vast majority are only exploited. Now, with the arrival of the Industrial Revolution, machines begin to do the work of people. And the more advanced technology becomes, the greater number of menial tasks will be provided by an entity, so far as we can tell right now, that does not have any feelings, does not suffer, and as such cannot be exploited in that sense. Right? When we talk about exploitation of resources, it is still in reference to the humans that might take advantage of them. So if we say some African country is plundered for its resources and exploited for its resources, the material goods still have no feelings themselves. The gold and the turquoise and the manganese and the cobalt, they don't care. But the people in those countries that might have benefited from them care that they instead are going to benefit China or Russia or the United States or Europe or wherever they're going to benefit some other people. So exploitation, whether talking about people or resources, has to do with people. Now, ruthlessness, and this word is very important. In the full embrace of what Americans call capitalism, they have embraced both actual capitalism, which is this system by which people make distributed decision-making process. Each person or each entity makes his or her own decisions in an economic sense, as well as from the nature of capital, how one invests it, and how profits are shared based on the investing of capital. This, by its very nature, does not include any moral prohibitions or elements that might rein in a ruthless person. No one lives in a purely capitalist society today. Everyone lives under some sort of government that has imposed limitations on how those with the resources can exploit those who work for meager resources by comparison to those that you can make and invest in. Much of this is born of history and terrible suffering. These restrictions were not at first in place, and so we had things like child labor and horribly unsafe practices in factories in which many people died in work accidents. And humans have a large scale pull towards morality as much as they do towards profit making or the look to better their own lives. And as such, moral outcry occurs in the face of things like the Triangle shirt factory and specific incidents of the Welsh village with the coal mining, right? People demand that governments intervene in order to regulate certain industries so that they're not only profit-seeking but also ethical, and thus not only looking to exploit those that create profits for them, but also take care of said people. Unfortunately, in the American discourse, ruthlessness is almost exclusively admired. And this is what the tech oligarchs on the left who espouse all of these woke politics have directly in common with the box store big business side of the Republican Party, which is a total appreciation of ruthlessness, and seeing that those who are harmed by their economic actions, in tech they like to talk about disruption all the time. When you disrupt an entire industry, you are destroying the livelihoods of many people that used to make a living in the old way. We don't have presently the right kinds of ethical and moral balances on the nature of disruption, right? Likewise, Walmart does the same thing, Walmart being the Republican side of the same coin. They have not only destroyed the mom and pop businesses of small town America that used to sell similar goods and simply cannot sell them at the same price that Walmart is able to do so at a profit. They have also killed culture in the same swoop, because in seeking endless profits and a ruthless attitude towards seeking those profits, there were no checks whatsoever that one town in America to the next wouldn't look exactly the same. Merle Haggard, a country western singer whom I admire very much and who died not too long ago, toured until the very end of his life, and he was asked, how has America changed the most since you began touring? And he said, well, in the 1960s, from one town to the next, you could tell what town you were in because each one was distinct. And by the time we live today, there's almost no difference save that of weather and climate from one town to the next. They've got exactly the same chains everywhere. And this is a product of ruthlessness. This is a product of saying that profit is what matters the most, and the damage to culture or long-term networks of survival are irrelevant in the face of the benefits that capitalism unchecked can bring. Now, any of us living through these times can see that that is not true, that there has to be a balance between this endless profit making and how much these companies are able to destroy what's in place without any promise of replacing it with something equally as valuable. So, we'll return to this topic soon. Thanks for joining.